Page 96 continued. Chapter 3 Feudal Economy in Three Kingdoms circa AD 750 to 1000. The existence of landed intermediaries, restrictions on the movement of artisans and peasants, and the decline of trade which appeared in the economy of Gupta and post-Gupta times were strengthened under the rule of the Palas, Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas. The Palas created many religious intermediaries inland. The endowments were enjoyed by Vaishnavite footnote 1 and Shaivite 2 temples. Far more important were the Buddhist monasteries 3. One of these, Nalanda, owned 200 villages in the second half of the 7th century 4. Their number was increased by 5 under Devapala in the 9th century 5. Udantapuri, Vikramshila and Jagaddala may similarly have possessed hundreds of villages. Further, we have records of several Brahmanas who were endowed with villages 6. It is suggested that such grants accounted only for a fraction of agricultural land in Bengal and that they did not touch the mass of cultivators 7. But if the pattern of expenditure under Harsha served as a model to his successors, it could appear that about 1/4 of land revenues may have been conferred on beneficiaries for educational and religious purposes. In any case, even the Pala grants that survive suggest that a sizable number of villages was held by priests, temples and monasteries. Para. We have no indication of bigger religious and educational institutions holding numerous villages in the Pratihara dominions, but several villages were granted as Agraharas 8 by the Pratihara kings. Besides these, villages were granted to individual priests and temples by both Pratihara rulers and their feudatories. Page 97 para. In the Rashtrakuta kingdom, far more villages were held by temples and brahmanas than in the Pala and Pratihara dominions taken together. Apart from grants of villages made singly by Rashtrakuta records speak of the re-grant of 400 villages by one ruler 9 and the grant by another ruler of 1400 villages, 600 agraharas and 800 villages to temples, devakulas 10. Thus, under the Rashtrakutas, priestly institutions rather than priests themselves seem to have emerged as important intermediaries in land, a feature not so characteristic of the Pala and Pratihara territories. This development seems to have taken place in Maharashtra under the influence of the south, where temples possessed more landed property than individual priests. Para. The Palas 11, Pratiharas 12 and the Rashtrakutas maintained certain secular intermediaries in land, vassals and officials, who were rewarded with villages for services rendered to the state. The epigraphic records show that their number was not as many as that of religious grantees. But if religious services were rewarded with and maintained by land grants, what could have been the other possible mode of rewarding secular services, especially when coins were not in common use? Perhaps these secular land grants were as many or more than religious, but since they were not expected to endure indefinitely, they were inscribed on palm leaf or cloth and therefore have perished. Probably the secular grantees were somewhat different from the religious. The first were free from all taxes to the state, 13, but the second possibly paid certain tributes. The first enjoyed perpetual occupancy rights over their benefices, but the second may have owned the estates only so long as they fulfilled their obligations to the king. Whatever the differences between the two sets of grantees, there is no doubt that they together constituted important intermediaries in land between the king on the one hand and the actual tillers of the soil on the other. For all practical purposes, they became the occupiers and enjoyers of the villages, thus giving rise to a class of landed barons who grew at the cost and with the sanction of royal authority over land. The grantee could take advantage of the terms of the grants to acquire or increase the area of land under his direct page 98, cultivation. An important feature they could exploit to their advantage was the absence of the demarcation of gift villages. But the Rashtrakuta grants invariably defined the boundaries of the villages given to the Donis, 14, who naturally could not extend their area of cultivation. The same was true of some Pala grants. Thus, in the case of 4 villages granted by Dharmapala in North Bengal, it was difficult for the beneficiary to expand his arable land or reserve outside his estate. But where this was not done, his resources could enable him to extend his demesne, DEMESNE. Most Pala and Pratihara charters do not specify the boundaries of the village but merely state that it was granted with its boundaries up to its pasture grounds and shrubs. Swasima-Trina-Yuti-Gochara-Paryanta. Hence, the grantee could push the boundaries further to add to the fields which were personally exploited by him. Another factor which contributed to the extension of the demesne of the grantee was the right of resumption of ownerless property conferred on him by the grantor. The practice prevailed in certain parts of the Pratihara kingdom in Rajasthan. According to a grant made by Mathana Deva, the local Pratihara governor in the Alwar region, the grantee was authorized to resume property if the daughter had no issue to inherit it. A-Putrika-Dhana 15. Or if there was no male heir. Nasti Bhatta ? Nasti, Nastibhartta. 16. To succeed to inheritance. The royal right of resumption was thus clearly transferred to the grantee, but occasions for the exercise of this right could not have been many. The process of individual occupation of land was carried forward by undermining the agrarian rights enjoyed by the village community. In Gupta times, land could not be purchased for religious grants by individuals without the consent of the local community and payment to royal officers. But the Pala kings paid only outward regard to communal rights. Along with vassals and officials, all the inhabitants of the village, right from the Brahmana down to the Aborigines and Chandalas, were invoked to give their consent matam, matam-astu, to the grant made by the Pala rulers, but that was an empty formality. In fact, their consent was taken for granted, and the villagers had to pay a great price for the observance of this fiction. In Gupta times, page 99, only the Vakataka grants refer to the transfer of rights to the enjoyment of mines, hide, and pasturage. This was done by implication, for the villagers were exempted from the obligations of supplying these to the state. 17. But now these resources were transferred in a positive way to the beneficiaries. Moreover, the practice was no longer confined to central India, but spread to eastern India, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and perhaps also to Maharashtra. Under the Palas 18 and Pratiharas 19, all agrarian rights such as the use of pasture grounds, fruit trees, reservoirs of water, bushes and thickets, forests, barren land, lowland, land under occasional flood, etc. were transferred to the Donis. There was no sense in specifying these resources of the village in post-Gupta grants unless the idea was to place them at the disposal of the Donis. Para. Under the Rashtrakutas, however, except for the rows of trees, Savriksha Mala Kulam 19, which too are mentioned in later grants, no other village resources were specifically transferred to the Donis. But the Rashtrakutas did not address the inhabitants of the gift village, nor did they specifically enjoin them to pay all dues and to carry out all the orders of the grantees as the Palas and Pratiharas did. The fact that the Rashtrakutas did not care even to notify formally the inhabitants concerned suggests that they paid scant attention to the village rights. Whatever the form of the Pratihara charters might mean, there is no doubt that the Palas and Pratiharas granted agrarian rights. Para. What did this transfer mean to the villagers? The king had the power to transfer agrarian rights, but of his actual enjoyment the grants do not give any hint. On the other hand, in view of traces of communal ownership of land in Gupta times and the analogy of the use of pastures etc. by the villagers as a whole in recent times, it would appear that these rights benefited the villagers. They could use pasture grounds, water reservoirs, forests etc. without making any payment to the king. Similarly, they could extend their arable land in the barren area. But once these agrarian rights were made over to the Donis, the villagers could no longer enjoy these advantages without giving some compensation to the recipients for his right of possession. What use the Donis made of their rights to village, page 100, appurtenances, appurtenances, and how it added to the burden of peasants can be visualized on the basis of the survivals of some fiscal practices in the 19th century. In some parts of Oudh, where there was valuable timber on the land, the Raja levied an axe, axe-tax, unquote, on the felling timber from all outsiders. 21. In the same area, the proprietary body did not take only the rent but also derive profits from the produce of the waste, such as thatching grass, fruits, etc., and also from that of fisheries. 22. The 19th century practices suggest that in the earlier period too, the grantees levied cesses on forests, grazing grounds, fisheries, fruits, etc. What is more important, the Doni could claim the barren land as his family property, depriving the villagers of the opportunity of expansion if they needed more land to feed the increasing number of mouths in their families. So the growth of individual occupancy rights in land among the Donis at the cost of the communal agrarian rights was a significant development. Para. While the king bartered away the communal rights to the Donis and consequently created individual rights in land, sometimes the communities also made over their joint proprietary rights to temples. The case of the town of Gwalior, which gave away several pieces of land to local temples, 23, is a good illustration of how communal property was turned into feudal property. The fields were transferred along with the cultivators who tilled them. 24. The two temples of 9 Durgas and Vishnu, which were endowed with fields, were built by the commander Allah. 25. And apparently the grant was made by the town under his pressure. We further learn that the whole town of Siadoni, Siadoni, gave a small field measuring 200 by 225 cubits, hastas, to Sri Narayana Bhattaraka, established by a merchant in the southern part of the town. 26. This land grant was not made under any duress, but in both cases the communal landed property was converted into individual property, which tended to be feudal because the gods and their priests would not cultivate the fields themselves but would get this done by others. Para. Just as in the Pratihara dominion, so also in those of the Rashtrakuta land was alienated by the communities in favor of temples, and this tended to convert it into private property. Page 101. Thus, in 865, under Amogavarsha I, 40 Mahajanas of Elpunus, Elpunusc, in the Dharwar district gave to a Pandita 85 mattaras of land. 27. An inscription from Sondatti, Sundatti, records a gift of land to a Jain temple made with the consent of 50 agriculturists. 28. In 951 to 52, under Krishna IV, in the Dharwar district, 12 mattaras of land was granted for the matha and education, probably with the consent of 50 Mahajanas who undertook to protect it. 29. Thus, it would seem that in Karnataka, local communities whose leading members were known as Mahajanas donated part of their communal land for religious and sometimes for educational purposes, but the grantees tended to establish their individual rights in such land. Para. The basic feature of West European feudal economy was serfdom, under which peasants were attached to the soil but did not own it. In villages given as grants under the Palas, Pratiharas, and the Rashtrakutas, the position of peasants was not materially different. An important factor which tended to depress the position of peasants was the practice of sub-infeudation. In a Pala grant from North Bihar, an official granted land out of his possession with the permission of his overlord Vigrahapala III, 1055 to 70. Footnote 30. Probably as a secular beneficiary, he could not do this without the sanction of the king. But the religious Donis, particularly the managers of big monasteries such as Nalanda, got their land cultivated by others and their rents were collected through their agents. Para. Under the Pratiharas, the grantees enjoyed not only powers of sub-infeudation but also of eviction. 31. In their dominions, especially in Rajasthan, Malwa, and Gujarat, the beneficiary was given the right to cultivate his benefice or get it cultivated, to enjoy it or to get it enjoyed, to do it or get it done. 32. A formula which was employed earlier by the Maitraka rulers of Vallavi. 33. It prevailed widely in the dominions of the Rashtrakutas. This implies that in Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, the king and his religious grantees could expel tenants from land. Altecker points out that the right of ejection is not mentioned, 34, but the terms of the grant presuppose temporary tenants who hold tenure at the discretion of the grantee. 35, who can replace them and get his land cultivated by others. Although eviction could be practiced, page 102, by the king in the villages directly under his control, being men on the spot, the grantees could exercise this right more effectively in the In the Pratihara and Rashtrakuta dominions, therefore, the peasants did not enjoy security of tenure. Thus, in many cases, the people who owned the land did not cultivate it. If the law book of Vyasa is any guide to the organization of agrarian economy in early medieval India, it would appear that in villages there were sometimes as many as 4 stages of intermediary landed interests between the king and the cultivator. 36.